Welcome to Night Shift Pulse. Comment your city and the time below. The night connects us all. If you enjoy what you hear, please subscribe. Let's step into the dark. I logged every crossing. Some of them were never human. The first time I understood what the desert was asking of me, I was standing alone in the floodless dark, looking at a stretch of sand that should have held prints. My handheld light slid over the ground in careful sweeps, and the soil reflected back only wind combs and brittle grass shadows. But the sensor log in my pocket insisted a human crossing had moved through that wash 3 minutes earlier, at a steady walking pace with gait compression that matched an adult male. I remember the exact calm I felt when I keyed my radio and said, "No sign, no sign," because I still believed the system could not be wrong. Then my own voice came back over the speaker a second later, softer, a half beat behind, repeating the same words in the same tone, like an echo with no canyon to live in. I had worked the southern Arizona desert long enough to know what the job looked like from the inside after the headlines burned out and the public arguments moved on. Most nights it was administration and patience, the slow intake of alerts, the careful triage of what mattered, and the routine paperwork that turned the desert into a ledger. I was a senior agent assigned to remote surveillance and field response out of a substation that sat far enough from town lights that the Milky Way looked like a spill. We had a small operations room with aging monitors, a half-functional printer, and a coffee pot that never tasted clean. The rest of the building was storage, a couple of bunks, and a garage bay with a dusty unit assigned to the shift, plus whatever somebody had abandoned in lockers over the years. My responsibility on graveyards was split between screens and sand. I monitored motion sensors, seismic sensor arrays buried in the earth along the corridor, and trail cameras mounted in low mesquite where they could see across natural funnels. The sensors were old in places, new in others, layered across decades of procurement cycles. Some were reliable, some were temperamental, and some produced ghosts, which was what we called activations that had no corresponding track sign, no thermal confirmation, and no obvious explanation. Every agency that worked remote ground knew about sensor ghosts. There were common causes. High wind could flex a post or swing brush in front of a motion sensor. Heat bloom artifacts on thermal cameras could imitate movement if the background temperature gradient shifted fast enough. Animals could trip seismic arrays, though their signal profile was usually different. A walking person had a rhythm to it, and after enough nights you learned the pattern the way you learned a familiar song. We logged everything anyway. Each alert became a line item. Each line item demanded a classification tier, a grid coordinate, a time, an initial response, and an outcome. I wrote incident reports in a clipped neutral style because that was how you survived audits and reviews. Seismic activation, probable foot traffic. Thermal intermittent, no visual wind conditions. Sign cut negative, possible sensor error. The act of writing was its own kind of patrol, a way of asserting that the world was measurable. A lot of people imagined the border as a single hard line, a place you could stand and see on both sides. In our sector it was mostly emptiness, interrupted by washes and ridges and by the quiet geometry of grid squares. Our map system broke the land into coordinate blocks, and we spoke about them the way a nurse spoke about rooms. Grid Sierra 24, Grid Echo 9, Section 4A. It let you compress miles of terrain into something you could say quickly over a radio when your mouth was dry and your pulse was steady. On a given night, I could be in the operations room taking sensor pings and dispatching a unit, or I could be in the field doing sign cutting, which meant reading the ground. Sign cutting was a craft, more than a protocol. You learned to see how a boot edge broke crust in a way a deer hoof did not. You learned the difference between a drag mark and a blown leaf. You learned how long a print had been there by how the wind had softened it, and how the desert's thin moisture had darkened and then faded. You learned that the desert erased evidence, but not evenly. A set of tracks might last an hour in one place and a day in another. You learned that the absence of tracks could mean no one had been there, or it could mean the ground had been wiped clean by a small local storm you never saw. And you learned, if you stayed long enough, that the system of sensors and cameras was another kind of desert. It had its own weather. It had patterns, it had false signals, it had blind spots, it had the fatigue of old equipment. It had a bureaucracy on top of it that preferred neat categories over complicated truths. There was a piece of paperwork we completed that almost nobody asked about, even though it appeared in our shift packets like a recurring form letter from a stranger. It was labeled Category Variance, and it was always attached to the end of the night's log bundle. It was not a report by itself. It was a checkbox in a short narrative field, and it asked whether any alerts or observations fell outside standard classification. Then it offered several pre-printed variance categories, each with a code, none of which were defined on the page. Most agents treated it like a nuisance. They marked none observed, signed, and moved on. I treated it the same way for years. I had a professional reflex for forms. Fill them, file them, get them out of your life. On nights when I did check a variance category, it was because the system forced me to. A sensor might log a human classification but show a movement speed that did not match. Or a camera might produce a thermal outline that looked like a person but lacked a corresponding motion activation. Or a seismic array might trigger in a way that suggested multiple footfalls, but the interval was off. Like the steps were too evenly spaced. The variance form let you flag it without explaining it. It was, on paper, a release valve. In practice, it felt like a padded room where you could put things that did not belong anywhere else. Those early months in the remote corridor were quiet enough that I noticed details other agents might have ignored. The substation's radio checks were sparse. The nighttime air had a metallic coolness that crept through cracks. The fluorescent lights in the operations room hummed at a pitch you could tune out, except when the building's power load shifted and the hum changed, and you realized you had been listening to it the whole time. At shift start, I signed in, pulled the handover notes, and scanned the previous log entries. The graveyard shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 in the morning, though we spoke it as graveyards like it was one long, unbroken organism. I checked the sensor health dashboard, noted which cameras were down, and ran a quick sweep through the last hour of recorded feeds. Then I waited for the desert to speak. The first irregularities I noticed felt like data quirks, and I cataloged them the way I cataloged any anomaly, calmly with an assumption that a rational explanation existed somewhere outside my immediate view. It started with recurring sensor activations in a low-traffic corridor we called the South Wash. The seismic array there was older, buried deep in compacted soil where the wash narrowed. It was sensitive enough that a rabbit could ping it, but the system's classifier usually sorted animal signatures correctly. A human had weight distribution and a stride cadence that showed up as a particular waveform. When the system tagged an activation as human probable, it was right more often than not. On 3 separate nights within 2 weeks, the South Wash array fired a human probable alert at nearly the same time, just after midnight. The first time I dispatched a unit from our side, but response time was long. The nearest agent was more than 30 minutes out because the corridor was remote and the roads were rough. By the time he arrived, the wash had gone quiet. He sign-cut the approach and found nothing, not even a scuff. He radioed back that the ground was hard and wind-blown, so maybe he missed it. I logged it as no sign, possible wind conditions, and moved on. The second time, I watched the alert come in while I had thermal on monitor 12. The thermal view covered the wash mouth. Heat bloom shimmered across the screen, the ground radiating. The system flagged a human probable, but the thermal showed nothing moving. I rewound the feed. Still nothing. I zoomed in and out, adjusted contrast. The screen remained empty except for the slow crawl of heat gradients. I wrote it up as human probable activation, no visual possible classification error. I checked category variance and selected one of the codes, the one that I had used occasionally for sensor mismatch. It was printed as variance code delta, which meant nothing to me. I signed and filed it. The third time, I decided to check it myself. When the alert hit, I took the unit out with the overhead lights off and drove the dirt road to the wash in careful, slow increments, knowing that speed would shake the vehicle and blur my own ability to see. The sky was clear, the stars sharp, and the desert smelled like cold dust. I parked back from the wash and approached on foot with a handheld light, low beam, careful not to wash out my night vision. I was calm in the way you were calm when you had done something so many times it became a procedure. The wash surface was smooth in places and broken in others. It held animal prints, small paw marks, a thin snake line, the occasional coyote track. The ground was readable. If a person had walked through recently, I should have seen it. I saw nothing, not even a disturbance. The soil looked as though it had been combed by wind and then left alone. I stood there for several minutes, scanning and listening. The only sound was wind moving through dry brush. My radio hissed softly. The sensor log on my handheld device still displayed the alert: human probable direction northbound, speed consistent with walking, event duration 40 seconds. There was no sense of fear in me then, only the professional irritation of missing data. In my mind, that was still a technical problem. I returned to the vehicle, drove back, and wrote the report. I noted no sign on scene. I checked the variance code again. When I brought it up casually to another agent on day shift, a veteran named Grant who had been in the sector longer than I had, he shrugged without looking up from his phone. "South Wash ghosts," he said. "That array's been weird forever." "Weird how?" He lifted one shoulder. "It pings. You check. Nothing there. You log it, it keeps pinging. Eventually somebody replaces it. Then the new one pings too." "That's not an answer," I said, but my tone stayed light. Grant looked up then, and his expression was flat, not hostile, just tired. "You're gonna drive yourself nuts trying to make the desert consistent," he said. "Log it and move on. That's what the supervisor wants. That's what the paperwork wants. Desert don't care what you want." It was an ordinary conversation. That was the unsettling part in retrospect, how easily the inexplicable could be dismissed as a personality quirk of the land, like a local superstition that was treated as a joke but still obeyed. After that, I started noticing other irregularities, not because I was hunting for them, but because once you saw a pattern, you began to recognize its edges elsewhere. The motion sensors along the ridgeline near Grid Sierra 2-4 began to fire in pairs, always 10 minutes apart, always with identical signal strength. It was not like wind. Wind produced chatter, multiple triggers, varying intensities. This was clean. The camera associated with that sensor, camera D7, captured nothing, not even brush movement. The infrared feed remained still. Yet the alerts were labeled human probable, and the system's confidence rating was high. Then there were the tracks. Not the absence of tracks, but the way they sometimes appeared briefly, like a message written in chalk and then wiped away. I found a set of prints once, just north of the borderline, heading into our side. They were barefoot prints, which was not unheard of but was uncommon. Smugglers and migrants typically wore shoes even if they were poor quality. Barefoot meant desperation or injury or something else. The prints were clear for about 20 yards, imprinted in a patch of damp sand where a small seep kept the soil darker. Then they stopped, not gradually, but as if the person had stepped from one, surface to another that left no mark. Beyond the last print, the sand was the same, damp, ready to receive an imprint, but it was undisturbed. The last print was full, heel and toes, weight pressed down. Then nothing. I stood there and tried to make it fit. Maybe the person had turned and stepped back in their own tracks, then walked away along the edge. I checked. No. Maybe they had climbed into brush. There was no disturbance. Maybe a vehicle had picked them up. The area was too rough, no tire marks. Maybe wind had wiped the continuation, but the initial prints were still sharp. Wind did not erase selectively like that. I documented it. I photographed it. I marked the grid coordinate. I added the photos to the report and submitted it. When I checked the archived copy later, the report was there, but the attachments were missing. Not flagged as missing. Not marked as an error. They were simply not present, like they had never been uploaded. That was the first time I felt a mild, professional unease that had nothing to do with the desert and everything to do with the institution. Systems could fail, files could corrupt, but attachments did not vanish cleanly while the report remained intact unless a human removed them, or unless some automated process stripped them out. I asked the evidence clerk at the main station the next day, a quiet person named Parker who handled digital submissions. Parker checked the system and frowned. "It shows you uploaded files," Parker said. "It shows they were received. It shows they were reclassified." "Reclassified how?" Parker scrolled, then stopped. "I can't see the details," Parker said. "It's in a different category, like a different storage bucket." "Can you pull them?" Parker shook their head. "Not with my permissions. It's not in evidence storage. It's in, I don't know. It's like it got routed to something else." "Who has access?" Parker hesitated. "Supervisors. Sector Intel. Maybe Tucson. I don't know." The answer should have triggered a formal request chain. It should have made me curious in a way that had to do with policy. But in that moment, what I felt was a small, cold sensation of being watched through paperwork. My attachments were not lost. They were moved. The system had decided they belonged somewhere I did not have access to. That night, back on Graveyards, I paid closer attention, not in a frantic way. In the same way I paid attention to tracks when I sign cut. Methodical, calm, gathering details. The anomalies had a texture. They were not random. They repeated. They had timing. They had preferred corridors. They had certain grid squares that lit up again and again across weeks and months in ways that did not match the patterns of human movement we usually saw. Smuggling traffic moved with logic, avoiding known patrol routes, using washes for cover, resting in certain mesquite stands. Migrants moved differently often, in groups, often following faint trails that had been worn by decades of crossings. Both left signs. Both showed up on thermal in ways you could interpret with practice. These anomalies did not behave like that. They appeared as if they had stepped into the system's awareness without stepping into the land itself. The first time I noticed the category variance codes recurring in relation to these events, I assumed it was because I was selecting them. But when I pulled prior shift packets, I saw other agents had been checking the same codes even when their narrative notes were minimal. Variance code Delta, variance code Echo, variance code Kilo. The codes meant nothing, but the act of selecting them felt like an agreed language. I asked a supervisor for clarification. That was my mistake, in the sense that it shifted the story from the desert to the institution, and institutions did not like questions that came with paper trails. My immediate supervisor on Graveyards was a man named Reed, solid, careful. The kind of supervisor who survived by never creating friction. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply redirected. I approached him in his office around 2 in the morning after a slow hour with my logs in hand. The office smelled like old coffee and toner. Reed listened while I explained the South Wash anomalies and the missing attachments. When I finished, he nodded once, slowly, as if I had described a routine equipment issue. "Log and move on," he said. "I did log," I said. "But the reports are being rerouted. Attachments are being stripped. The variance codes aren't defined anywhere. If this is a known issue, I need to know the protocol." Reed leaned back slightly. His expression remained neutral. "Your protocol is to log," he said. "Your protocol is to respond when dispatched. Your protocol is to maintain chain of custody. Beyond that, you are not intel." "I'm not asking for intel," I said. "I'm asking what these codes mean." Reed's eyes flicked to the folder in my hands, then back to my face. "Those codes are administrative," he said. "They exist for classification purposes. You don't need to know what every classification bucket means." "That doesn't make sense," I said, still calm but feeling the edges of irritation. "Classification affects response. It affects whether we pursue. If the system is calling something human probable and we're not finding sign, either the system is wrong or something else is happening." Reed's voice stayed even. "The desert plays tricks," he said. "Sensors play tricks. You're not new to that." "I'm not new," I said. "That's why I'm asking." For the first time, Reed's neutrality shifted. It wasn't anger. It was a soft warning, the kind that could be denied later if confronted. "Be careful about over-documenting anomalies," he said. "You know how it looks when an agent starts writing reports that don't match reality." I stared at him, not because I didn't understand, but because I did. "You mean it looks like I'm unreliable?" I said. Reed did not answer directly. He held my gaze for a moment, then looked down at his desk. "I mean, you don't want to be the guy who sees ghosts in the sand," he said. "We have enough issues. Don't make yourself one." I left his office with the logs still in my hands. In the operations room, the fluorescent hum felt louder. The monitors displayed empty terrain. The radio hissed. The building settled. The institution had spoken more clearly than the desert had. After that, my requests for clarification were met with soft barriers. Emails went unanswered. A phone call to Sector Intel was transferred and then dropped. When I asked the evidence clerk again about the missing attachments, Parker told me quietly that they had been advised not to discuss it further. "You're not in trouble," Parker said, glancing around as if the walls had ears. "It's just, don't ask me. I don't want my access flagged." That phrase lodged in my mind. Access flagged. Not a person flagged, not a report flagged. Access. As if the system watched who tried to see what. I responded the way I had been trained to respond to any operational obstacle. I adapted. If I couldn't get answers through people, I would get them through records. Our databases had layers. The current system, modern enough to feel corporate, held active incident reports and sensor logs. But there were legacy databases, older interfaces that some agents avoided because they were slow and poorly designed. They contained scanned documents, old reports, and things that had been migrated over the years. Most people only went into them when they had to pull a case file for court. I had no court case. I had a question. On a slow graveyard shift around 3 in the morning, I logged into the legacy system using my credentials. The interface was clunky, with gray boxes and drop-down menus that looked like they had been designed before people cared about user experience. I searched for category variants first. The system returned thousands of entries, most of them blank forms. It was too broad, so I narrowed it. I searched for the variance code I had used. Delta. The system returned entries spanning decades. That in itself was odd. Codes might persist, but the language of forms changed, and our forms had been redesigned multiple times. Yet Delta appeared consistently, associated with incidents in the same grid squares I had been seeing. I clicked into a report from the late 1990s. It was a scanned document typed, with handwritten notes in the margins. The narrative field was short. Seismic activation, human probable, no sign on response, variance code Delta selected, logged per protocol. The phrasing was almost identical to mine. The handwriting in the margin, barely legible, said something like, "Do not pursue." I opened another from the early 2000s, same grid, same phrasing. Another from the 1980s, scanned from a dot matrix printout. Same. At first I told myself this was institutional copy-paste. Of course, phrasing repeated. Of course, agents wrote in the same clipped style. But the consistency was too clean, like a template that had been preserved across generations. Then I noticed something else. The approvals. Every report had a supervisor sign-off. That was normal. But these reports also had an additional approval line, a routing stamp that indicated where the report went after the station. Most reports went to case management or sector intel, depending on content. These reports went somewhere else. The routing stamp was abbreviated in a way I didn't recognize, and the destination was not listed. What I did recognize was the pattern of speed. These reports were approved quickly, often within minutes, and the approvals were logged as automatic. The system had a way of marking automated actions, and these reports had it. I sat there in the operations room alone with the fluorescent hum and the empty monitors, and I felt something like vertigo, not because of a supernatural fear, but because of bureaucratic certainty. The system had rules, and those rules were being applied consistently across decades to something that was not being explained to the people doing the work. I searched other variance codes, Echo, Kilo. Each produced similar results: recurring grid squares, recurring phrasing, recurring quick approvals, recurring missing attachments. I began to map them. At first, the mapping was mental. I recognized grid names, I knew the terrain. But mental mapping was not enough. I created a personal spreadsheet on my own device at home, careful not to violate policy by exporting sensitive data. I didn't include names or case numbers. I included only dates, approximate times, grid squares, and variance codes. It was a private pattern chart, not a data breach. That was how I justified it to myself. The pattern that emerged over weeks was not random. Certain grid squares lit up repeatedly, regardless of season, regardless of weather, regardless of known traffic trends. The activations clustered around narrow corridors, washes, ridgelines, a dry canyon we called the Bone Cut because of old cattle remains found there decades ago. The times were also patterned. The activations often occurred at the same windows, just after midnight, just before 3 in the morning, and sometimes at dawn, when the desert's temperature shifted. The system often classified them as human probable. Sometimes it classified them as unknown movement, but the variance codes remained consistent. What disturbed me most was what did not happen. In our work, a sensor alert typically triggered a response even if it was delayed. A unit would be dispatched if available. If not, the alert would be monitored. If the alert suggested a large group, additional resources might be called. Even if we couldn't intercept, we would at least attempt. With these events, the dispatch pattern was different. The logs showed responses that were logged as monitor only, even when units were available. Sometimes a unit was dispatched and then recalled without explanation. Sometimes the report indicated no action required, a phrase that usually appeared for obvious false alarms, but here it appeared alongside high-confidence human probable signals. It looked on paper like we were choosing not to respond. At first, I assumed this was a chain of mistakes, a series of decisions made by tired supervisors, a gradual normalization of sensor ghosts. But the deeper I looked, the more I saw the same behavior in different eras, under different supervisors with different technology. The same monitor only, the same no action required. The same variance codes. The institution was not failing to intercept. It was declining to intercept. I began to feel isolated in a way that had nothing to do with the desert's emptiness. In the operations room, there were cameras in the corners pointed at the desks. They were there for security, for accountability. I had never minded them. Now I found myself aware of them as eyes. When I sat at the legacy system terminal, I kept my posture normal, my movements routine, as if I could hide curiosity by making it look like work. On the radio, I heard other agents do routine checks. Voices came through static, calm, bored. They talked about weather, about equipment, about a dog that had wandered near the station. None of them talked about variance codes or missing attachments. The silence around it felt deliberate, but also effortless, like everyone had agreed without speaking that certain questions did not exist. I tested small questions. I asked an older agent, a man named Drew, Agent A, whether he had ever used variance codes. Drew snorted. "That stupid form," he said. "Yeah, everybody uses it." "Do you know what the codes mean?" Drew looked at me like I had asked why the sky was blue. "Means something for the computers," he said. "Means something for people in Tucson who like their categories." "Have you ever seen a code defined anywhere?" Drew shrugged. "Not my problem." "What about Delta?" Drew's expression flickered just for a second. Then he smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Delta's for weird stuff," he said. "You must be bored." I let it go. That was the technique. You let it go so you could watch what changed in their face. Later, when Drew walked away, I noticed he did not look back at me. He looked up at one of the cameras in the corner as he passed under it, and his gaze lingered there briefly, like a man acknowledging a silent supervisor. The determined research phase of my life began, without ceremony. It was not a moment of decision. It was a gradual shift, the way a person realizes they have been walking toward a door for a long time. I started accessing retired agent logs, scanned notebooks that had been entered into the legacy system during some old digitization effort. They were messy, full of handwritten comments, shorthand personal observations. Most were mundane, complaints about equipment, notes about reliable trails, reminders about water caches. Then I found one that was not mundane. It was a log from a retired agent whose name I recognized because a road near our substation was informally named after him. The log was from the early 1970s, long before the modern sensor network. The pages were scanned from a bound notebook. The handwriting was neat, careful. I read it slowly, line by line, because handwriting demanded patience. On several pages, the agent had written about walkers that left no tracks in certain ground. He had written about hearing radio traffic that wasn't on their frequency. Voices repeating their own transmissions a half beat behind. He had written about lights moving in washes without casting illumination. He had written in a clipped professional way that these events were to be logged, not pursued. He had used those words, logged, not pursued. There were no variance codes in those days, but there were categories. The agent had drawn his own, a small table in the margin. Type 1, human traffic. Type 2, animal. Type 3, unknown crossing. And next to unknown crossing, he had drawn a symbol that looked like a simple vertical line with a short crossbar like a signpost. Then, in another margin, he had written, "They are counted." I leaned back in my chair in the operations room and stared at the wall. The fluorescent hum pressed against my skull. I felt for the first time a kind of fear that was not cinematic. It was bureaucratic. It was the fear of realizing you were part of a process whose purpose was not what you had believed. I continued digging. I found standardized phrasing in reports from the 1980s that matched modern phrasing too closely. No physical corroboration. No sign-on response. Logged per protocol. It was as if the language itself had been preserved, transmitted through training without being explained. I found specific grid squares flagged repeatedly across generations. Grid Sierra 2-4, South Wash, Bone Cut, a ridge we called the Ladder because of a line of old fence posts that looked like rungs in moonlight. I searched for those grid squares in the database and I found something else: internal memos. Most memos were about equipment and staffing, but buried in the legacy system were scanned pages labeled as operational guidance, with dates spanning decades. They were short, sterile, and vague. They referenced non-interdiction events. They referenced e-variance categories requiring no field engagement. They referenced automatic approval routing. They did not explain why. One memo dated in the late 1990s contained a sentence that I read 3 times to make sure I had it right. Certain crossings are to be recorded for longitudinal tracking purposes. Interference is not required and may be counterproductive. Counterproductive to what? The horror element was not a creature in the desert. It was the realization that the system had always known something moved through, and the system's design was to acknowledge it without stopping it. At home, I printed maps and marked grid squares with dots, careful not to include sensitive details. The dots formed a loose line that ran parallel to the border but not on it, like a second boundary drawn by something that did not obey political lines. The dots clustered around certain land features, not around roads or towns. They avoided places with heavy presence. They favored emptiness. I began to think of the anomalies not as sensor ghosts, but as a separate category of movement that the sensors were built to detect. That thought was irrational, and I knew it. I knew how sensors were procured, how arrays were installed. They were designed to catch humans and vehicles. They were not designed to catch something else. And yet, the variance codes existed. The memos existed. The repeated phrasing existed. The approvals existed. One night, around 2 in the morning, a South Wash alert came in again. Human probable northbound, duration 40 seconds. I watched monitor 12, empty. I checked camera D7, empty. I listened to the radio, quiet. I should have logged it and moved on. That was what Reed wanted. That was what the institution wanted. Instead, I took the unit out again. The drive to South Wash felt longer that night, though the distance was the same. The desert was colder. The sky was overcast, which made the darkness thicker. When I parked and approached on foot, my light beam felt too narrow, like it couldn't reach far enough. I found the wash surface smooth, windblown. I found animal tracks. I found nothing human. Then my radio crackled. "Unit in the wash," a voice said, low, distorted by static. I stopped. My call sign was not "Unit in the wash." The voice was not Reed's. It was not dispatch. It was not any agent I recognized. The words were spoken in a calm, flat tone, like a status update. I keyed my mic. "Say again," I said. Static. Then faintly the voice repeated, "Unit in the wash." I felt my skin tighten, not in panic, but in alertness. My professional mind ran through possibilities. Interference, a transmitter leak, a nearby agency using similar frequency, a prank. I keyed again. "Identify," I said. Silence. Then my own voice came back, delayed, repeating "identify" in the same tone I had used, like a recording. I froze. The sensation was not supernatural in the moment. It was technical. It was the wrong kind of feedback. Radio echoes happened, but they had a certain sound, a bounce, a fade. This was clean. This was my voice returned as if someone had listened and then spoken it back. I shut off my mic and listened. The radio hissed softly. Then I heard footsteps. They were not on the radio. They were in the wash, somewhere ahead of me, walking at a steady pace. The sound was faint, muffled by sand. It was the sound of someone moving without urgency. I raised my light and swept it across the wash. The beam caught nothing but brush and sand. The footsteps continued, steady, approaching, then veering slightly as if walking past me in the darkness. I stood still, light held out, and listened as the footsteps moved away, then stopped. Silence settled. I did not chase. That was not fear. That was training. You did not run into the dark without a visual. You did not compromise your own safety. You waited, you observed. You called for backup if needed. I keyed my mic and called it in as a possible contact. I kept my voice calm, professional. There was no response from dispatch for several seconds. Then Reed's voice came through, slightly strained. "Negative," he said. "Log and clear." "Negative on what?" I asked. "Log and clear," Reed repeated. "No action required." I stared into the darkness. The footsteps had been real. The radio echo had been real. The system's alert had been real. "Copy," I said, because that was what you said when a supervisor gave an instruction. Back at the substation, I wrote the report. I included the sensor alert, the lack of sign, the audio observation. I did not include the radio echo. I hesitated, then deleted the sentence. I thought of Reed's warning about over-documenting anomalies. I thought of being labeled unreliable. I thought of access being flagged. I checked variance code Delta. When I submitted the report, the system returned an approval confirmation instantly, faster than any human could have read it. It was stamped as automatic. I sat back and watched the confirmation message like it was a living thing. That was when the horrifying pattern began to emerge in full, not as a collection of odd events, but as a coherent design. I mapped anomalies across time and geography more aggressively. I used my off hours to review old reports. I built a timeline. I looked for interdiction attempts, for arrests, for any case where an anomaly event led to a capture. I found none. There were arrests in those corridors, plenty of them, but they corresponded to normal traffic. The anomaly events were always logged and then left alone. The reports often used phrases like "no action required," "monitor only," "non-interdiction event." I began to suspect that the system's purpose was not to stop these crossings. It was to count them. The thought was absurd until it wasn't. Because counting was what we did when we wanted to know a trend without intervening. Counting was what you did with wildlife populations, with traffic flow, with weather data. Counting was a passive act. It acknowledged something existed without changing it. I looked back at the old agent's notebook. They are counted. I thought about the variance codes. They were not explanations, they were labels. They were tags for a database. I thought about the memos, longitudinal tracking purposes. Longitudinal meant across time. It meant measuring something's movement pattern over years, decades. What moved through the desert for decades, triggering sensors, leaving no tracks, echoing radio voices, and was never pursued? I tried to rationalize it in mundane ways. Could it be a classified operation, a military training route, a surveillance team? But why would it leave no tracks? Why would it echo voices? Why would it be logged as human probable but not intercepted? And why would that pattern persist across technology eras, across supervisors, across administrations? The answer that formed in my mind was not a single creature, not a single phenomenon. It was a category of reality that the institution had learned to treat as administrative. In the operations room, the monitors became less like windows and more like instruments in a lab. The desert beyond them was no longer just terrain. It was a field where something moved under observation. The institution's calmness about it was the most frightening part. There were no alarms, no emergency meetings, no warnings. There was only paperwork. One night I noticed that approvals for variance code Delta reports were routed through a chain that bypassed local enforcement entirely. The log showed the report being categorized, stamped, and archived without any review by our station. It was like it had been intercepted by the system itself and sent elsewhere. I tried to trace where it went. The destination label was still abbreviated, still unfamiliar. I searched the internal directory for that abbreviation. No result. It did not exist in any visible organizational chart. I began to feel the professional anxiety that came with incompetence. Not because I was failing to do my job, but because my job had shifted under my feet. If the true purpose was to log, then all my instincts about interdiction were irrelevant. If the system was designed to count something, then my role was not protective, it was clerical. That was the kind of realization that eroded identity. I had built my sense of self around competence, around being the person who could read terrain and act. Now competence meant noticing something I was not supposed to notice, and action was not required. The institution had turned my expertise into a measuring tool. I requested reassignment, not dramatically. I filed a routine request citing fatigue and desire for a different rotation. It was a normal career move. Agents transferred sectors, all the time. Reed called me into his office the next morning just before shift end. The office smelled the same: coffee, toner, stale air. He held my request in his hand. He looked at it, then at me. His expression was calm, almost kind. "You're a good agent," Reed said. "You know that, right?" "I know I do my job," I said. Reed nodded. "This request," he said, tapping the paper, "is going to raise questions." "About what?" I asked. Reed's eyes stayed on mine. "About why now," he said. "About what you've been looking at." I felt my throat tighten slightly. "I'm allowed to look at reports," I said. "You are," Reed said. "But you're also allowed to be smart about what you make into a problem." "I didn't make anything into a problem," I said. "I found inconsistencies." Reed leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if the building itself might listen. "They're not inconsistencies," he said. "They're categories." "What does Delta mean?" I asked, because once he had acknowledged it, I couldn't not ask. Reed's expression remained neutral. "Delta means you log," he said. "Delta means you clear. Delta means you don't chase what you can't catch." "That's still not an answer." Reed exhaled softly. "You want an answer that makes you feel like you're in control," he said. "You're not. None of us are. We do what we're told. We do what the system is built for." "What is the system built for?" I asked. Reed paused. In that pause, I felt something shift, like a door opening a fraction. "It's built to count," he said finally. The words landed without drama. He didn't whisper them like a secret. He said them like a fact you might tell someone about payroll procedures. "Count what?" I asked, though I already knew the shape of the question. Reed looked down at his desk, then back up. "Crossings," he said. "Not people," I said. Reed's mouth tightened slightly. "Some of them are people," he said. "Some of them aren't." My skin prickled. The office felt smaller. "You've seen one," Reed said, watching my face. "Or you've heard one. That's why you're here." I didn't answer. My silence was an admission. Reed leaned back again. His composure returned fully. "Your reassignment request is denied," he said. "Not because you're in trouble, because you're in position. You're where you're supposed to be." "That sounds like a threat," I said. Reed's expression softened, almost sympathetic. "It's not a threat," he said. "It's a fact. This corridor needs people who can log accurately. Most agents don't notice the difference. You do. That's valuable. Valuable to who? I asked. Reed's eyes flicked upward toward the corner of the office where a small camera lens stared down. He didn't need to say anything else. I left his office and went back into the operations room. The monitors showed empty desert. The radio hissed. The fluorescent lights hummed. I felt in that moment the loss of agency that came with institutional entrapment. If Reed was right, then my attempts to escape were not just denied, they were anticipated. My curiosity had not made me an outsider. It had made me useful. That night, my shift began the same way it always did. I signed in. I checked the sensor dashboard. I reviewed handover notes. The routine felt obscene in its normalcy. Around midnight, a variance alert came in from Bone Cut. Human probable, direction northbound, speed consistent with walking, duration 40 seconds. I watched the monitors. Empty. I felt my stomach tighten slightly, not with fear of a thing in the desert, but with the awareness that I was about to participate in counting something I did not understand. I logged it. I checked variance code Delta. The system stamped the report as automatically approved. Then in the middle of the night, I noticed something new in the dashboard. A small flag icon next to my own log entries. It was not an error indicator. It was not a warning. It was a status marker. When I hovered my cursor over it, a tooltip appeared. Longitudinal integrity monitored. My breath caught a small involuntary reaction. The words were clinical, but they implied a kind of surveillance that was personal. My reporting integrity was being monitored over time. I was being measured as a measuring instrument. From that point, the desert began to feel less like a place I worked and more like a place that worked through me. The anomalies continued. Sensor activations with no sign. Radio echoes. Footsteps in empty washes. The occasional moment when a thermal feed showed a shape that was almost human, moving at the edge of contrast and then dissolving into heat bloom as if it had never been there. I stopped trying to chase them. I stopped asking questions, not because I accepted it, but because the institution had made it clear that action was not part of my role. That was the final phase of the story, the forced participation, and it did not arrive with a dramatic collapse. It arrived the way bureaucracies always won, through routine. One night near dawn, an alert came in from Grid Sierra 24, human probable high confidence. I was in the field already, parked near the ridgeline, doing a quiet patrol loop. The air was cold. The sky was beginning to lighten at the horizon. I could smell creosote and dust. The alert was close. I drove toward it and stopped at the edge of a shallow wash. I got out and walked forward with my light off, letting the early gray light do the work. And then I saw it. At first, it looked like a person standing in the wash about 50 yards away. The silhouette was upright, still facing me. It had the proportions of a human, head, shoulders, arms at its sides. If I had seen it on thermal, I would have called it a contact. But in the weak light, something was wrong. The edges of the silhouette were too clean, like a cutout. The darkness of it was not shadow. It was absence. A patch of night still clinging to a shape while the rest of the desert brightened. I stood still. My training told me to announce myself, to give commands, to call for backup. My body stayed calm, but my mind felt detached, observing. The silhouette did not move. Then, without changing posture, it seemed to shift, not stepping, not turning, but relocating, as if the wash itself had blinked and it was now 10 yards to the left. No sand moved, no sound came. It was simply elsewhere. My radio crackled softly and my own voice came through, delayed, saying nothing, just breathing, as if the radio had decided my presence itself was a transmission. I did not speak. I did not raise my weapon. I watched. The silhouette shifted again, closer now, still not walking. The shape remained human-like, but the distance between us closed without motion. I felt a pressure in my ears like a change in altitude. The desert air seemed to thicken. The sound of wind stopped. Even the small insects that normally made faint noise in the brush fell silent. The silhouette was now close enough that I should have seen details, clothing, face. I saw none. It was a human outline filled with the absence of light. I realized in that moment that the sensors were not misclassifying it. They were doing the best they could with a category that did not exist. Human probable was the closest label the system had for an upright crossing with a stride pattern it could not truly interpret. And I realized something else, a thought that slid into me with the cold certainty of paperwork. It did not matter whether I understood it. The institution did not require understanding. It required logging. The silhouette tilted its head slightly as if acknowledging me. Then it did something that finally broke my composure, not because it was violent, but because it was administrative. A faint sound came from my handheld device, a notification chime. I looked down, and the incident report template had opened automatically on the screen. The grid coordinate was pre-filled. The time was pre-filled. The classification was already selected. Variance code Delta was highlighted. All that remained was for me to enter a narrative. My hands felt cold. I stared at the blank narrative field. I could hear my own breathing. The silhouette stood in front of me, silent, waiting, as if the act it required from me was not physical but clerical. I looked up again and the silhouette was gone. Not moved away, gone. The wash was empty. The early light showed sand and brush and nothing else. I looked down at the device again. The report template remained open, waiting. I typed one sentence. It was the sentence I had typed 100 times before. Sensor activation, human probable, no sign on response, logged per protocol. I submitted it. The system approved it instantly. I drove back to the substation with the sunrise at my back, and I felt a quiet resignation settle into me. Not acceptance, not peace. Something colder. The recognition that my job had never been to stop crossings, only to log them, and that by logging I was not merely observing. I was participating in whatever process required counting. I remained on duty for months after that. I continued to log. I continued to fill out variance forms. I stopped attaching photos. I stopped writing detailed narratives. The less I described, the less the system seemed to push back. But the flag icon remained next to my entries. Longitudinal integrity monitored. It watched my consistency. It watched my compliance. Sometimes in the operations room, when the radio hissed in the quiet hours, I heard my own voice beneath it, repeating words I hadn't said yet, like the system was practicing my testimony in advance. Sometimes when I drove the corridor at night, I saw faint, upright shapes at the edge of my headlights that vanished when I blinked. I never stopped for them. I logged the sensor pings instead. And once, when I checked the legacy database out of habit, I found a report dated next month, already filed under my name, already approved, already marked with variance code Delta. The narrative field was blank, waiting for the words I had always used. I understood then that the desert did not need me to believe. It only needed me to keep writing. If something crosses the line often enough, the system stops calling it an intrusion and starts calling it a metric. And when the metric has your name on it, you begin to wonder whether you were ever the one doing the counting, or whether you were just another crossing the institution learned to log.